On this episode of Blending Bourbon, be sure to join Dixon Dedman of 2XO Whiskey and myself, David Mark Young from Golden Sheaf, as we talk with Colin Spoelman from Kings County Distillery and how he started their operation, what they're up to today, and all of the amazing things that they have in their future.
Blending Bourbon is the podcast that takes you beyond the barrel and behind the scenes of the whiskey industry with master blenders Dixon Dedman and David Mark Young.
Welcome to another episode of Blending Bourbon, a podcast sponsored by Golden Sheaf. My name is Dixon Dedman from 2XO Whiskey. As always, I'm joined by my partner in crime and former male hair model, Mr. David Mark Young, blender, owner, proprietor, and all the things at Golden Sheaf. Sorry, I had to do that.
You did, didn't you?
Yeah.
I knew I would regret that.
Yeah, you should have never sent me that picture.
Never again will I be vulnerable and transparent.
You'll slip up again, and I'll make you pay for it.
Well, that was a blast from the past. Hi, Dixon.
Hey, buddy.
How are you today?
I'm good.
Good. Yeah, thanks for sharing that picture. I was hoping that would come up.
You knew it would.
We're gonna subtly just skip right over that one and get right into the. I don't know. You want to talk about it? I might need a therapy session after that.
That's what this is, isn't it?
Is that what this is?
I think so.
Whiskey and therapy. Yeah. You know, I think the reason I shared that picture was because, and I've given this so much thought, probably way too much thought, because you guys, I don't know if you're being facetious or if this is envy or I don't know what's going on, but there's this reference to my hair, which I'm 50 years old, so I'm grateful to have hair. And
oh, you got a strong head of lettuce there. Don't talk like that, brother.
That was back in the day, and gosh, I don't even want to go into detail about what was going on in that picture. But
well, just so you know, it's the wallpaper on my cell phone. Just so you know.
Well, I've truly been thinking. It actually kept me up a little bit at night, trying to think, gosh, how do I respond to that? Do I just sit and kind of? So I've been trying to figure that out. So I think I'm just gonna.
I just let it go, man. Just let it go.
Shake my head and say thanks. Yeah. Appreciate it and move on.
Yes. Let's move on.
Here we are on episode number, I have no idea, but we've got quite a few under our belt and we've got quite a few banked. This particular episode, I'm super psyched about. I love when we have guests on. Today we are honored to have Colin Spoelman himself from Kings County Distillery. This is where I get fanboyish. And Kings County is one of my all-time favorites. My brother introduced me to Kings County bourbon years ago. This is when you guys had screw caps on the bottles, and they just looked it reminded me of some of the historic bottles I have from Golden Sheaf. You know, they look like legacy types of bottles. You guys have done a really good job. But
it's funny you should mention that, David.
Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Colin Spoelman, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
I want to share something with you, Colin. This is pretty cool. So when I first was just into bourbon before I'd started anything, it had to be what year did you start putting stuff into the market?
Oh, like 2010 was when we first started selling anything, mostly in New York.
Okay, I think it was like 2012, maybe 2013. And that was when all the Facebook groups were real big. Like you're always in a Facebook, like all the bourbon groups. And I remember we hosted a big group that I was very active in at the inn here in Kentucky. And my wife's like, who are these people that are coming down that you're spending the weekend with? And I'm like, oh, just people I met on the internet, which is like super weird or whatever. But there was a guy that brought me this box.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah.
And as you said, David, the old school. And this one, this Kings County Distillery bourbon whiskey was from barrel number 104. So I don't know if you can date that one or how far back that one goes or whatever, but I've got barrel 104 and he's like, have you tried it? And I was like, no, this is way too cool. Like, I don't want to, right. This is really cool. I have the box open. Like, people all the time are kind of picking it up in my office and like, what is this? This is awesome. So anyway, thought I'd show you that. It was pretty cool.
It's a thing that because the bottles are so small, it's a little easier for it to get around. You know, it was I feel like that was part of being in New York City is that people shop very differently for booze than anywhere else because they don't want to carry, 3 750s back to their apartment. So people tended to really embrace the smaller formats, whereas you go anywhere else in America and people are like, what, are you trying to cheat me with this 375? Right. People get all upset that you got a 375 or a 200 ml. So, but I mean, I feel like the good news of it is that it did get kind of around to people that were, genuinely curious about like bourbon being made outside of Kentucky, which at the time, was a little unusual, and now, is everybody sort of embraced as a reality.
And Colin, you have ties to Kentucky, is that right?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
I was born in Kentucky. Lived my entire misspent youth in Kentucky, and really sort of in the like Eastern Kentucky, which if you know Kentucky, Eastern Kentucky is the like moonshine and coal mining and marijuana and shooting people kind of part of the state. And
yeah, my sister lives there and loves it down there.
yeah. No, I mean it's cool. But then, I moved to New York and everybody's kind of like, oh, Kentucky, fried chicken and bourbon, So I was like, okay, well, actually, I'm not really from that part of Kentucky, but eventually I just embraced it and was sort of like, okay, bourbon, sure. I'll do that. But I'll do you one better, and I've got this moonshine that I picked up last time I was in Eastern Kentucky, and you want to try some? And everybody was like, oh, yeah, definitely want to try some. And it was terrible stuff. I mean, it was just it was not good stuff. But New York City is a very culinary and adventurous sort of place. So people were kind of, and you couldn't get real moonshine. That was something that prior to 2000, prior to like the Moonshiner show on TV and everything kind of blowing up in the moonshine world, people were genuinely kind of curious about it and eager to try it at parties. And like so that's how I kind of got.
I've heard about this. Let's see what the hell this is all about, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Were you like setting it on fire so that people could see that if it's a blue flame, it's safe to drink?
I did foolishly set it on fire not in my apartment, but on the roof of my apartment. And as you may know, it's actually quite difficult to put out an alcohol fire. Yeah. And so that was a party trick that I did once and never did again. But I was a little younger when this all takes place, so it maybe makes a little bit more sense in that context.
So if you could go back to kind of when you began down the path of what you're doing now, what were the influences? What were the key things that intrigued you and influenced you to get into whiskey and bourbon, producing whiskey?
Right.
And bourbon?
Right. Well, I mean, it was not, it was just sort of picking up from that moment when I've got this moonshine in my apartment and everybody's kind of curious about it. And I think, how hard could it be to just, instead of going back to Kentucky, couldn't I just make this stuff? I mean, I'm getting it from the drummer to my high school band who's got some connection to some guy who's got some connection to some other guy, and I could just save myself a little bit of trouble. And so, and the internet was making things like talking about moonshine, you could do it anonymously and kind of get some information and get pointed to the right places to buy a still. I mean, I think historically, if you wanted to make moonshine, you had to build your own still. Yeah. And I think there was a moment in the, sort of late 90s, early 2000, mid 2000s, where you could actually, start to buy a still, look on the internet on how to run it, get a book. It was just like there was more information available, and some of that stuff, which kind of led hobby distillers, which is what a moonshiner really is, in a certain sense, to come out of the woodwork a little bit online and kind of share that kind of information. So with my roommate at the time, we got a still off the internet and started puttering around with it, not necessarily with the intention to start a craft distillery and what that sort of contemporary sense means, but I was just gonna, I don't know, see if I could do it. It was just one of those like challenges. And I made some and shared it with people, and they were like, well, this tastes like garbage. Why can't you make it taste good? And I was like, okay, I mean, if that's what you want, that's the first
Challenge
time anybody
accepted.
has ever, that's the first time anybody has asked me to improve the taste of moonshine, because what do you think you're drinking in the first place? Right. And hence that was the first distinction between, sort of Kentucky moonshine and like Brooklyn moonshine, is that there was some sort of expectation that the Brooklyn stuff should be good, and that there, as opposed to in Kentucky, where if you're drinking moonshine, you're just, getting there fast as far as I'm concerned. So, then I was like genuinely sort of curious about that. And everybody sort of understands that time improves whiskey, but nobody spends a whole lot of time thinking about what are the other variables that make whiskey good.
Right.
If you have two 0-year-old whiskeys, what makes one very, palatable and one not very palatable? So that's how I got interested in then doing iterations on this kind of moonshine thing, and eventually came up with a, double pot distilled white whiskey that really, to some extent, I was going around to restaurants, and white whiskey was kind of having a moment back in 2010. And so or this is like 2008, 9, and kind of shared it with people in a sort of blind tasting context, and would just say, well, okay, one of these I made, and 3 of these are on your back bar. Which one do you like? And 9 times out of 10, they would pick the stuff that I had made, and that was the sort of confidence threshold. Now, this is being compared against like something called Virginia Lightning, and Georgia Moon, and some of the commercially available white whiskeys at the time. They were all sort of gimmicky and aiming at aiming at the Kentucky audience, not the Brooklyn audience. So it was a little bit of just adapting to the sort of situation in front of me. But that sort of blind tasting series was enough to kind of get the confidence to go, well, maybe we should look for a lawyer and get a license and kind of get this out of my apartment and go legitimate. And so that is when my college roommate, David Haskell, and I sat down and, looked for a lawyer, looked for the New York laws around distilling, and, kind of realized that it was a good time to get into distilling. And in fact, the license fee was even being reduced that particular year because they created what's called a farm distillery. And so it was going to be $128. Federal license was free. So from a sort of cost of getting up and running, it was not that expensive. And I could just take my apartment still over to the commercially licensed distillery and throw it in there. And we got 4 more of those little hobby stills. And it was enough to kind of like get going and, get the brand into liquor stores, and started with moonshine, started with white whiskey, but kind of very quickly realized that would have maybe a limited appeal. And so once you go down the road of distilling, immediately your first question is, well, what is this going to taste like after a year in a barrel, or 2 years in a barrel, or 25 years in a barrel? Right. It's just a never ending sort of, mystique that you immediately begin to pursue. So So that's what got us started. Then 2 years after that, we moved to Brooklyn Navy Yard into this historical old building, beautiful building. And and that is where we have been for the past 11 years. And, I think if we started by making moonshine and a chocolate whiskey and some kind of, sort of whiskeys that were designed to kind of be a little out there or not necessarily going for the like whiskey connoisseur, I think always my intent was to make really great whiskeys, whether that was unaged whiskey or 2-year whiskey or 4-year whiskeys. But you just, that obviously that takes time. So you start laying down your whiskey, and it's only really now that we have 7-8-year-old stuff and, have kind of caught up to the to our peers in the Kentucky world who are, aging things that long. And simultaneously, the world of American whiskey has changed so much,
right,
that any of the older whiskey that was $25 on the shelf is now $125 on the shelf. Mm-hmm. And so there's price parity, there's age parity. And I think, people who were immediately dismissive of a New York whiskey have kind of come around, and they're kind of curious. And we've sort of shied away from doing Kentucky bourbon in Brooklyn, but we're doing, something different. We're doing something that's a little bit at the intersection of Kentucky tradition and Scotch tradition and Irish tradition and moonshine tradition. It's kind of like a little bit of a grab bag.
Right. Yeah.
Is that kind of in reference to like your grain bills kind of thing, or is it the pot still type thing, or is it a little bit of all of that? I mean,
it ends up being a little bit of all of that. In terms of pot stills, obviously, is a big distinction. Using different size barrels is, it's not common in the U.S., but it's more common in Scotland. We do a high malt bourbon. So it's 20% malted barley, 80% corn. So the flavor grain is malted barley. That's a bit unusual. We ferment off the grain. That's a little bit, more like Scotch. Mm-hmm. And I think even ultimately we put a lot of, like, if there's an author to our whiskeys, it's Ryan, who is our head blender, as opposed to the head distiller. And that's also, I think, maybe a little bit more of a Scotch approach, where the sensory person is the author of the whiskeys, not the operator of the equipment. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sometimes those are the same people, but increasingly it's not. So those are, but also in the styles of whiskey that we're doing a high malt bourbon, but then we also do a peated bourbon, mm-hmm. and we have an American single malt. We have a rye whiskey that's a high rye whiskey. So kind of just in existing in this kind of like, let's kind of not necessarily make straight bourbon and straight rye whiskey and kind of play around as much as we can, knowing that our audience is probably more international than, most localities. If we were in Chicago, we might do the business slightly differently. If we were in San Francisco, we might do the business slightly differently. But in New York, we have a very international whiskey audience, mm-hmm. for sure.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and at some point, if for folks listening or watching, if you've never visited Kings County Distillery in Brooklyn, it's an incredible experience. And I'm really curious how that converged, how it sounds like you've got this knowledge and experience, and you're evolving your products, and you just kind of jumped right into it, and then we moved into your current location, which you're absolutely right. It's absolutely, and I'm going to tell you a real quick story. The first time I visited the distillery, so I think I was like up near Columbus Circle, kind of the opposite side of Manhattan, and it was getting late in the day, and all day long I was thinking, I want to get out of this meeting and get down to Kings County, and my meeting kept going later and later. So long story short, I get out of there, and I call, hey, what time are your tours? And, do I have time? And they said, yeah, you have about 15 minutes. so I tell them where I'm at, and they said, oh, don't worry. And as I'm kind of heading in that direction, I'm trying to select my, the best route to get there. Do I get a cab? Do I get an Uber? Do I go underground? So I end up jumping on the subway and head in that direction. And by the time I pop up above ground, it's pouring rain. And so I've got, 2 or 3 blocks from the terminal there. And so I'm sprinting, and I'm in, full suit, tie, all the things. And they said, take your time, we'll wait for you. So I'm watching my, the time. And so I'm sprinting. This is where all my marathon training comes in.
Yeah, I bet your hair was a mess.
It was. It absolutely was. Yeah. So and next thing you know, I get there and I pop in the doors, and I'm just dripping wet. And somebody greets me and says, "Oh, you must be Dave. Welcome." And it was, I was so panicked, like, I'm going to miss this, but I have to get there. And everybody was so friendly and welcoming. And they there were 2 or 3 couples that were waiting for the tour to begin. And they said, no worries. Everybody was really cool. So they gave me time to sit and kind of dry out a little bit, and then have a little cocktail prior to beginning the tour. And then, and I'm just loving this experience. We're down looking at the stills, and we're in the barrel room, and we're, and then we're in the little classroom there. And you were actually standing there with a group of folks talking about something. And I'm really big into history. Golden Sheaf has a pretty rich history, and so I'm asking questions, and I'm thinking, is that Colin right there? Is that Colin? I just want to say hi, and hopefully I didn't want to leave the tour abruptly because they waited for me, but I wanted to with you. Yeah. And long story short, I didn't get a chance to come over and say hi, but I did get to chat with some of the folks there, and gosh, it was just such a wonderful experience. And I didn't want to leave. It was I've been there a few times since then. And I know at the time you guys were doing these quarterly presentations that, you bring folks in and talk about history and all of the things. And I had shared kind of what I was getting into with Golden Sheaf, and at the time I just kind of secured a few trademarks and really just starting to get going. And they invited me to come out and share that story. It never panned out. COVID happened, unfortunately, but hopefully we can revisit that sometime. But such a wonderful experience, incredible place. How did you stumble upon that? How did you?
Well, right, yeah. So, I mean, history is important, right? I mean, you brought that up because obviously we're in this very historical part, even of New York City, and New York City has this great history. I mean, it's just you can't, you walk over a subway grade and a homeless person, and you go into like a Starbucks, and it was like Alexander Hamilton slept, in the bathroom,
Right.
So it was just kind of a little bit coincidental and a little fortuitous that the Navy Yard was looking for new tenants, and they were kind of recruiting for tenants. The Navy Yard is the old Brooklyn shipbuilding for the U.S. Navy, but also now run by the city of New York as a kind of small business incubator. So they really approached us as kind of, it was a fit for their program. And we were dead set on being in Williamsburg, which is like, the cool neighborhood or whatever. Right. But there were no buildings that were, it would have been just like a garage, nothing particularly exciting on the architectural front. And then I I was kind of into architecture and kind of into history. So I was like, well, I'll just take this guy's tour and see, just more as a way to get into the Navy Yard, which is not open to the public, and get to kind of go exploring in these old, buildings that are falling apart that were from 100 years ago. And saw the building that we're in, the paymaster, and was just like, oh, we have to change our plans. This is so much better than what we were going to be doing. Yeah. And because the city is our landlord, it's actually a smart move, because now 10 years later, we've had to kind of, our lease was up. So we had to, and fortunately for us, and not necessarily for all the distilleries in town, when your lease is up, they'll put up an apartment building. You know, the land is very valuable in New York. And so, so we've been lucky both in that regard, both to have a great space and also to be sort of able to somewhat, you know, depend on being there for a long time to come, which is very important for whiskey because it's a long game.
So it's funny. We've had a couple people who were dumb enough to agree to join our podcast, and
welcome to the club.
Yeah, you've joined that. That really. And one of the things that we've talked about with a lot of people, and David and I've talked at length. You know, I talk about starting Kentucky Owl, man. I mean, I almost did it because enough people told me that I couldn't. You know, and. And we put some stuff together, and with the entire plan was, if it doesn't work out, I've got a bunch of whiskey to pour at my kids' weddings one day or whatever. Like we did not have a plan. We did not. And we, you know, my partner at that time and I kind of followed suit with him. He just had this, he could feel out a situation, and he made very smart business decisions in all his things. And, you know, we kind of followed that, and then, you know, but it, you know, that whole, like, the genesis of the whole thing was kind of like, well, this would be cool. And I know people keep saying you're crazy, but I've been called that my whole life. So let's just run with it. And then, and to a certain extent, David, you know, he's running into some of the things we all ran into when you're kind of in that sourcing game. It's like, oh man, I was kind of building this plan around this steady supply of this liquid, and this is changing, and this is, you know, and like, I'm curious, you know, are you kind of like us in that whole, like, let's just go with it and see what happens? Or are you all very strategic? Like, right. Okay, we want to be at this many cases in 2 years, and this many cases at year 8, and this, you know, is it, you kind of like, is it like, man, I just love what I'm doing, and let's just see where it goes, kind of thing?
I think it's more directed than that. I mean, we're definitely trying to grow the business, but to grow the business in a, you know, I mean, we're just making as much as we can possibly make, and but we're small, you know, so that's not ever going to be a rival to, you know, I mean, it's still going to be, even when we are, you know, 5 times bigger than we are now, we'll still be a pretty small brand, maybe a national, you know, we hope to be kind of in the best stores in the best states, you know, like in, you know, and have some international distribution, but not necessarily like grow at any cost, take over the world. You know, I mean, we didn't use a column still. You know, we've made a lot of decisions throughout the whole thing to kind of go away from the commercial choice. And sometimes, you know, I mean, as fun as it is to run a small business, at some point you want it to be a little bit bigger business. And that's definitely like very baked in. Like, we can't deviate. Like, next year we'll have 20% more cases than we had this year. And the year after that we'll have maybe 35% more cases than this year, but it's pretty fixed.
Yeah.
And with the way whiskey is right now, I mean, we'll sell it all, you know, like, sales is not a problem.
Oh, yeah.
So, you know, it does become a little bit like, well, then the fun of it is just kind of, it's all kind of set up. I mean, if we didn't make it 4 years ago, we don't have it. So in a way, it's nice that it is dependable. I mean, that's the sort of, and I guess I'll say, instead of contracts for, you know, source barrels, I still have to get contracts for the wood, which is increasingly hard to come by. And, you know, there's plenty of things that create challenges on the day to day that ultimately probably aren't that different. So, you know, it is, it's a little bit of a different game because there's no like big like opportunity to flip it to a strategic company. But it's also not like a family business in the sense that like, I'm going to like hand it to my kids. It is this kind of like mid-sized small business that that, so far so good. It's kind of, for me, I still love whiskey, like that, has not changed at all. And I feel like the landscape of whiskey has gotten more accepting of kind of exactly what we're doing. So that's been pretty exciting. And I guess, it's just, there's a lot of exciting stuff happening in American whiskey. It's a great time to be in this business as opposed to something like beer, which is declining,
right,
or hard seltzers, which are a fad, or, it does feel like a very,
I've said it many times,
long-term business.
I just spent 14 weeks on the road and it's not a terrible thing if you're traveling to be traveling, selling whiskey and drinking bourbon with people. I'm kind of glad I'm not like Tommy Boy out there trying to sell brake pads, because I don't think I'd enjoy it near as much.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it can be a little bit of a hard road where you are traveling a lot and you're drinking a lot, and that, at a certain point, it's nice to be back home and to mellow out a little bit. But COVID kind of was that,
Yeah,
that
for
was
sure.
a nice break from everything. So, I think,
So is that kind of the plan? Like you just, you increase production every year, you're moving what you got this great little team that you work with that you enjoy, and you all are building something together. And it's, I lived that world for a little while where I was partnered with a large monster machine, and that kind of takes some of your soul a little bit, and
I haven't heard too many people say how great it is, so I'm somewhat cautious in that regard, but also it's a business, and the goal of a business is to make money. And I feel like I've built something that has some value. So, at a certain point, I'm not going to say, I would never sell, because I would definitely sell.
Yeah. Never say never.
Somebody wants to overpay for it, great, cool. Sure. Yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
But, I think it's, I don't necessarily want to change what I do for a living. And this is kind of what I want to do for as long as I'm working,
There's a pretty good, collective of New York and New York State distillers up there. I mean, do you all have do you get together? Do you all connect? Is that kind of a thing, or not really?
It has been more of a thing with Empire Rye. I mean, I used to consider every other distiller in New York State my, bitter enemy, because, how dare they? And that's it's cage match. We're all fighting for the same shelf space and all that stuff. So, and I'm a very competitive person. But then Nicole Austin, who worked for us for a long time, and got together with some of the other New York distillers. She was much more friendly with our enemies, and hatched this idea to do something called Empire Rye, which was to be a rye whiskey that each of the distillers would make according to the same recipe from New York grain, distilled in New York. And I thought, I don't know, who cares? What really differentiates it is the flavor and what we're doing. That's the pot stills and all this. Who cares just that it's New York grown rye? I don't think anybody's going to care about that. But I was wrong. Everybody cares about that. Geography is very important in the way that people think about whiskey. And to have something that belonged to New York as opposed to Kentucky was very appealing. And it was a project where I could sell not just our whiskeys, but the whiskeys of everybody else, and feel good about it, and feel in a sort of collaborative way that we were all pushing this collective agenda, which was not in opposition to each other. And so it ended up being a great project, and now we can barely make enough of it. So,
That's awesome.
So we have gotten to, and actually I will say, the New York distillers are all very cool people. Distillers are cool people. I mean, it takes, as you say, you have to be crazy. You have to be extraordinarily you have to have a certain kind of charisma to be able to walk into a room and say, I make this stuff that's, it's like toxic to your body. Come drink
so
it with
good.
me. Right. Come get yourself a little closer to your, deathbed by hanging out and drinking this thing that I made. Yeah, exactly. So, like Tom Potter runs New York Distilling Company, and he was half of the Brooklyn Brewery and kind of an elder statesman in the spirit space. And just getting to know kind of who everybody else has been a lot of fun. And I guess I feel that way about all the distillers that I get to meet. The most fun I think you can have drinking with distillers and people who know the whiskey business in and out. I mean, it's just
right.
There's a lot.
Those conversations, those cause me to drink a lot, but they are interesting conversations. Okay,
it's not right. You might not
from what I
remember them the next day. Yeah, exactly.
We'd be kind of remiss not to, but I understand that you are an accomplished author as well.
Yes.
How many books are you up to at this point?
Well, I'm working on my third book.
Okay.
So the first book was called The Guide to Urban Moonshining, which was a little bit of if you want to make whiskey at home and, you and you're dead set on that, you could follow the instructions and make pretty much, it just kind of lays it out in a very non-technical, pretty basic, informative way of how you, mash in a lobster pot and what kind of yeast to use and how do you load that into a little hobby still and how much heads and hearts and tails do you take? Just very kind of, not a lot of different recipes in there, just kind of like basic stuff. But that book allowed me to kind of go travel around Kentucky and visit distilleries, because it wasn't just about making whiskey, but it was also about like the commercial landscape of whiskey. There was a graphic in the book that shows all these different family trees of bourbon, like all the different mash bills and corporate owners and where everything comes from. And it's kind of demystifying the commercial world of bourbon, because I guess for me, one of the reasons that I got so interested in distilling is I felt like I loved bourbon, but bourbon had really been taken away from Kentuckians in a certain sense, because it all belonged to Diageo and Campari and, these global companies that in certain cases, certainly Diageo's case, didn't really understand bourbon. I mean, they understand Scotch whiskey, but kind of treated bourbon as this like joke to follow Scotch. And, I just felt like there was so much opportunity to make bourbon, in the way that it used to be made, in the way that it should be made. And so, so I kind of, was interested in being a little provocative with that book that was kind of just saying, a lot of this stuff is not really that interesting, but there's so much opportunity and so much history and so much tradition that is still valid. And I think, in the past 10 years, a lot of people have come up and seized a lot of that opportunity. I mean, the landscape of Kentucky bourbon looks a lot different than it did when that book came out in 2013, where, you really had Jim Beam and Brown Foreman and a few others, Right. It was really like 80% of the whiskey that was sold came from either Jim Beam or Jack Daniels.
Right.
And now, there's a lot more variety. There's a lot more different distillers. There's a lot of different kinds of distillers, whether you're looking at column still, big distillers, pot still, small distillers, even within the tradition of Kentucky bourbon. And then you've got all this stuff going on outside of that too. You've got single malts from the Northwest and Texas whiskey, which is very barrel forward and barbecue forward. And so, it's just, so that book was a little bit kind of introducing somebody to the world of whiskey if they didn't know anything about it at all. And then the second book was called Dead Distillers, and that was really part of the fun of writing the first book was to get into the New York City history of distilling, but also kind of touching on some of the stuff. And so I went to write that book. I went to go visit cemeteries in Louisville and Bardstown, and Cincinnati has a lot of distillers buried there, and really telling, in some cases, lost stories. Well, that I was working on, there's a distillery in Brooklyn that has dead distillers, and I was like, were there ever distilleries in Brooklyn? That doesn't, I mean, nobody ever thinks of Brooklyn as a place where there were distilleries, but there really were pre-Civil War, really. There were a lot of distillers. And so kind of learning some of those stories, and then, getting to know, people like Jim Beam and Jack Daniel, but Isaac Bernheim and kind of some people that are a little further afield off the beaten path. And then, U.S. presidents were distillers. George Washington.
Right.
William Henry Harrison is just outside Cincinnati, had a distillery. Andrew Jackson, of course. But just there's this kind of like crazy, wild history. Again, distillers are cool people, and they've always been cool people. And I think because of the vice aspect of distilling, you have to have a certain kind of personality to like get past the vice. So that was a fun book to write. And then the next book that I'm working on is just traveling around the country, talking about all the whiskeys that are new to some extent. If you're going to be in Kentucky, where should you go visit, and what should you drink? And if you're going to be in Seattle, where should you go and what should you drink? And if you're going to be in Nashville, so.
That sounds really cool. What's the expected?
Yeah.
Let's you and I turn that into like a TV series, and we'll just travel to all these places and drink.
I mean,
done and
I think it sounds great.
Yeah.
I pitched that. I had that idea pitched to me one time, and we ended up, it was COVID that killed it, but it was going to be one of those things like when, where do you go when you're in a certain city? Where do you go, and how do you drink whiskey like a local? And that was kind of the premise of the thing. And I thought that I was like, that sounds like a ton of fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
You're gonna have to censor me a lot.
Maybe more fun to make than to watch. But I don't know. I can watch it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think our production company would be on board with that too.
Yeah. So, but anyway, I've also been using the opportunity of the book to revisit a lot of whiskeys that, that I had, kind of like things change in 10 years, and you may not have had a whiskey for 10 years and have an impression of it and then go revisit it and be pleasantly surprised. And I think, what you care about changes over time. I mean, that's just true of anybody in any business, but,
that sounds fascinating. When's your anticipated release date for that book?
I'm hoping for fall of 23.
Nice.
So it's like still forever. I mean, the book is written. Let me just be clear. It's written. It's like pretty much designed. I'm just working on some like tasting notes right now, but it takes that long.
Oh, that's my favorite part is tasting notes. That is so much fun. Dude, Colin, I'll tell you, I don't know how often you get back. I don't know if your family's still in Kentucky or not, or if you visit very often, but dude, next time you're in town, please let me know. I'd love to have a couple pours with you and tell some lies. And
yes, I think that would be quite fun. And let's do it.
I mean, if David's not shooting
I was there
Pantene commercial, he could come visit or something,
Smile and wave.
We'll
smile and wave.
Let's go. We'll set it up. We'll make sure we visit the hair salon and do some drinking.
Welcome to the club. I love that idea. I feel like a lot of ideas come out of this podcast. This is what it turns into, is kind of a brainstorming session. But I love that idea. Let's make that happen, and we'll shoot a podcast. We'll record a podcast. We'll record some content.
Are you talking about you love the idea of getting your hair done, or you love the idea of getting? Is that which one are you talking about?
We'll all go get manis, petties, drink some whiskey.
Yeah,
tell
we'll
some stories.
Right. Colin and I'll see you after. Clearly, he and I care a lot less about what our hair looks like than you do.
Definitely.
Oh man.
No, man, this has been awesome. Yeah. Thank you for coming on. Thanks for doing this. Actually, I almost feel like we just kind of hit the tip of the iceberg. So if we can drag you back on here again sometime and revisit, some of this stuff and talk about what's to come and what's the, in the future and things like that, that would be really cool.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely would love a part 2. And, I've got all these questions coming to mind, but we obviously want to limit the window of this particular episode. But yeah, I would love to have you back in the future, Colin. It's been such a pleasure. Thanks for sharing and giving us your time. And gosh, what an honor, folks! If you've not been to Kings County Distillery in Brooklyn, you have to. It's an absolute must to visit. Such a wonderful experience. Maybe you'll run into Colin and be able to pick his brain and yeah, absolutely.
And I will say, we do have whiskeys. We're distributed in like 20 states.
Oh, good for you.
We are even distributed in Kentucky and Tennessee. So and Missouri too. So so we're findable, not maybe
that's
easily findable, but the kind of boutiquey places that seek out the more, I don't even want to call our whiskeys unusual, but I guess in the scheme of things, maybe they're somewhat perceived that way. But yeah, our bourbon is our most popular, and then our peated bourbon is probably the next most popular whiskey that we make.
Mm-hmm.
So those would be good places to start if anybody's curious to get into Kings County.
You guys have a pretty good online presence as well. You can buy direct from your website.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I should just say it goes to usually a New York retailer who then fills the order. So we can't actually ship direct, but it's
like a reserve bar setup. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's like I said, there's so many things coming to mind. I would love to revisit this, get into some of the history. I recall, not to get into the weeds, but I recall some of the stories I heard about the Brooklyn whiskey wars.
The Brooklyn whiskey wars.
And kind of how the neighborhood would come together to alert folks that the feds are coming, or the prohibition police, and throwing bricks from the third stories of buildings and those things. Fascinating.
It was women and children throwing the bricks.
Yeah.
The story was told correctly. Yeah.
Well, let's do it again soon.
The men were busy hiding. Yeah.
Or making
Thanks, Dave.
distilling. Yeah, thank you very much, Colin Spoelman from Kings County Distillery.
Yes, thank you for taking David's call. A lot of people don't do that. We really appreciate you doing that. Thank you.
We'll send you a bottle of 2XO for your time. Thank you very much.
Good, yeah, good.
Folks, don't forget to like, share, follow, subscribe. This we're trying to get this content out there for those whiskey nerds, obsessors, folks that love to talk about and drink whiskey and get kind of down into the weeds. So we appreciate your following, and be sure to follow, subscribe, all the things. Thanks again, Colin Spoelman. Dixon, always a pleasure. Thanks for joining us, Dixon Deadman.
That's the big Dixon FU right there. No, I appreciate it. Y'all have a good one.
Cheers, everybody.
Cheers.
We'll see you next time.